federal IT experts on operationalizing the cybersecurity executive order. My name is Mark Emery, managing partner of the Emery Group. And on behalf of RockITek and AttackIQ partner, I'm pleased to moderate today's webinar. In May, President Biden signed an executive order mandating a number of actions to be undertaken by NIST, OMB, CISA, and the federal civilian agencies. These include actions on zero trust, data protection and identity management, supply chain risk management, and vulnerability detection and remediation. The panel is going to focus on just two of these cybersecurity challenges: vulnerability detection and management, and implementing zero trust in the federal government. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists and ask each to make an opening statement, and we'll start with a few questions. But I ask our attendees, please post your questions in the chat window. Our first panelist is Carron, who's the CIO and Associate Inspector General for the Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General. Jerry, please tell us a little about the Inspector General's mission at HHS and how the executive order will spur investments in zero trust security framework and at OIG and at other civilian agencies.
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me. Yes, as the Chief Information Officer for HHS OIG, definitely responsible for OIT to support the OIG mission. Our OIG mission, we are the largest OIG in the federal government and the executive branch with 1,600 users, not counting the contractors. We have a unique mission. Of course, you have the general audit and things that a regular OIG does, but we also have investigators who do Medicaid, Medicare fraud, opioid investigations, and organized crime investigations, as well as we have many lawyers also that do litigation on such things as well for the healthcare industry. So very unique mission here at the OIG. As far as investing in zero trust, as you would know, I'm a big advocate of zero trust, been influencing or trying to push it for years now. And it's definitely something that's near and dear to my heart. Developed an architecture some years ago, been focusing on as a co-chair on the CIO's Innovation Council on Zero Trust, as well as a nonprofit called ATT&CK, co-chairing a Zero Trust working group there. I think it's very important. I think it's a different focus. I think with the executive order, it's getting us to be more effective rather than just compliant. Because if you look at 853, you can say your system needs authentication. And I can use the username and password, but that's compliant, but it's not effective. And I think what the executive order is really trying to do is push us towards effectiveness. So definitely I'm all in on investment in zero trust. It's a lot of the, if you look at it technically, it's a lot of the tried and true things that we've been doing for years. You know, the identity aspect, least privilege, authentication. However, I think what it is it's finally putting it all together as a rather than doing it in stovepipes, doing it as an architecture framework and making all these concepts so that we can do dynamic risk scoring based off numbers of factors, whether we be in the cloud or on premise. You're on mute, Mark.
Thank you, Jerry. And that was my least privilege there, I think. So our next panelist is Jason Mueller. Jason's the Chief Federal Architect for AttackIQ. Jason, how is the federal requirement for threat defense optimization compared to commercial? And does the executive order speak to how agencies should prepare their threat defenses?
Yeah, so thanks, Mark. And just piggybacking off of what Jerry had mentioned, that really resonates across federal and commercial agencies is compliance does not equal or equate to effectiveness, right? So we want to get to this place to where we can start to, like our CEO, Brett Galloway had mentioned, start to attack ourselves like the adversary does and has been doing for a number of years now. Now, that being said, the private sector versus that of the public sector, as we all know, they're depending on who you're speaking to, what vertical, it's subjective in nature, but there is this notion that there's this big, huge bucket of money that the private sector can dip into without having to go through these rigorous procurement policies and whatnot. And that's the reason, as we all know, why they're somewhat ahead of the curve, if you will. Now, adopting a zero trust model is great, right? I'm a big fan of it. I think policy is in that regard around cybersecurity is necessary. However, enforcing policy is another, right? Operationalizing that policy and starting to say, okay, we understand that things are broken. We're going to build out the zero trust architecture, and we're going to take this assumed breach methodology. And now we're, instead of mapping out RMF frameworks, we're going to start to adopt this MIBR attack framework, and we're going to start to understand where these gaps and weaknesses may lie outside of a common vulnerability or an exploit.
Thank you, Jason. And our third panelist is Darren House. Darren is the Senior Cybersecurity Advisor for RockITek, and with over 20 years experience in IT and cybersecurity, brings a wealth of knowledge here to this discussion. Darren, talk about your cyber concerns. How does the executive order, is it addressing these concerns, and how will RockITek clients, ones like AttackIQ, be able to leverage the executive order to help protect federal agency missions from cyber threats?
Thanks, Mark. So I think the best way to really address concerns about it is the work that needs to be done to operationalize the executive order. And when I say operationalize, what I really mean is to make it useful in the real world, right? Turning the abstract words into architectures that can be implemented and measured for impact as well. And I'll give you two quick examples to try and identify what I'm trying to talk about. In Section 3, it talks about adopting security best practices. Right. And if we look at least privilege, we've been talking about this for a long time, but talking about least privilege is completely different than actually operationalizing this concept. And so what I really want to talk about is that there are emerging technology companies out there that can provide guidance on how to operationalize this concept. You know, one mechanism that uses monitoring the historical access of user behavior, and then asking questions like, if user X has not accessed resource Y in Z timeframe, then maybe we can have a policy-based approach to automatically remove that access from that user because they're not using it. And that's a great way to start operationalizing the security best practice in the real world. A second example would be in Section 7, where it talks about emerging technologies, and it also talks about maximizing early detection. And I think we all can agree that the sooner we know that bad things are happening, the sooner we can take action and make it better, right? So when we talk about operationalizing the early detection pieces, it requires some organizational maturity to obtain and understand and act on that data, that threat intelligence data. But the data really does matter, right? Because the data shows us things like when we talk about SolarWinds, we know that the adversary had their infrastructure in place months before the attack, right? But what you might not know is that there are emerging technology companies out there that are able to do things like identify that adversaries were selling access to SolarWinds in cybercrime markets, or understanding that there are some technology companies out there that were able to identify the command and control infrastructure that was used in SolarWinds before the attacks happened. And so they were able to advise their customers where they could put block lists for IPs and domains to mitigate some of the risk of that SolarWinds attack. And then you take companies like AttackIQ, who provide this great capability of breach and attack simulation to continuously validate these controls in place, like the least privileged controls for customers, right? So I think the end result is that we want the federal government to be able to operationalize this executive order so they can realize some of the same benefits that were achieved by the customers of these emerging technology companies.
Thank you, Darren. So for those of us in the audience, if you have questions for Jerry or Darren or Jason, please type them into the chat room. We want to get to as many of your questions as possible at the time we have here in the networking session. But Jerry, here's a question. How are agency zero trust implementations threat informed?
It depends on the agency, because some agencies have a robust security, cybersecurity arm or office. Some have very small with very few people. But I mean, there are a lot of the tools that we have to take advantage of. You know, we get some telemetry and some updates from them, which is good. Darren, of course, you know, I'm a government employee. I can't promote, but you know, I have worked with AttackIQ before. You know, things that they do, they're able to see anomalies and things like that. So great way to automate your blue teaming or even your red teaming, I think, which I think we need more of. But finding those weaknesses, we know, my experience has been, you know, without a change management program in place, it's usually the humans that cause the outages and things like that, or have the bad admin hygiene, and those are the things that we get popped on. and things like that. So I think having just a good, and Darren talked about protecting the data. Well, it's hard to protect what's not normal if you don't know what normal looks like. So I think you really got to be able to baseline, know where your data is, know what the categorization of that data is, and know where it's going. And is that really supposed to be where it is going? Because what I'm talking about when I talk about zero trust is taking in a number of factors, not just taking in, oh, you pop this factor, boom. It's got to be a number of factors with a methodology of what is your risk tolerance. And I think we all, as federal agencies, we have different risk tolerances. And it's important to understand what your risk tolerances is so you can take action. But if you don't know what normal looks like, how do you know whether to take action or not? But as far as the, understanding the threats, I use a number of sources. There's always things, partners. I think what I'd like to see, of course, DHS provides us information from a federal agency standpoint, but I'd like to see more information sharing and more things within that area. I think, down the barriers of, being all these special snowflakes that we are, and really start better sharing the data. And I think the executive order speaks to that. How can we better work with industry and government to get better data sharing when something happens, that everybody's aware, so everybody knows what actions they can potentially take, so that they're not popped as well, for lack of a better term.
Jason, Jerry said something very interesting to me, that a lot of bad things happen in enterprises and their networks because of actions that humans take, and good change management isn't practiced. You can be very susceptible to that. How can an agency, continuously test their cyber defenses to know that whether it was a change management mistake or a zero-day type event happened or a phishing attack, and they actually have a bad actor on their network?
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And to piggyback, I agree completely with what Jerry was mentioning there too, and to take an agnostic approach from that of being, of course, I'm biased. I work for AttackIQ, but outside of that, what we've built here is a way to operationalize that the MIBR attack framework, right? And that essentially is mapping risk. Now, you get out of it what you put into it, meaning that if you're starting to assess risk based on simply detonating malicious payloads to understand whether or not they could be susceptible to exploitation, that's only one small piece of the puzzle, right? It's really about the fact of what we talked about before, is assuming breach. If we assume breach and we have this methodology in place and we know that's not a matter of if, but when. And then, by the way, I love saying this now because 10 years ago, it was selling fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And now we live in a world where, unfortunately, this is the reality of which we live in. We absolutely need to get ahead of it. And the way in which we get ahead of it is understanding that when security controls fail, they fail silently, right? Much like a fire alarm system or something along those lines, it's normally too late. But if we have this methodology in place and the capability to take from the community the MIBR attack framework and start to map out by way of cyber kill chain type playbooks, et cetera, to really understand that we know that regardless of what payload or phishing or whatever methodology they want to get in, perhaps it was a credentials that they were stolen that were just hanging out in the wild, they're going to get in. But now let's start to map risk across the environment based on playing out these attacks in a way that is safe, but we start to grab this empirical data from these assets that are considered critical infrastructure in our environments, your domain controllers, your high value targets, high value individuals. Assuming a zero trust architecture, again, I'm a huge fan of, but we need to be able to validate that. We need to validate the fact that when we're building this out architecturally, more isn't good, better, right? More isn't better, better is better, as our CEO says. So I think that we are making a lot of progress, right? And we have competitors in this space that are operationalizing the MIBR attack framework as well. But it all collectively comes back again from this agnostic approach, is that we want the community, especially the public sector, to be much more secure and protect our intellectual property as much as possible. And the way that I said, again, we get to that point is by implementing not only this executive order that's been pushed down, but also operationalizing that and taking that approach that now we need to start to test as our adversaries would, to really truly map out risk in an empirical fashion so that we can start to make data-driven decisions. Ultimately, that's what it's about. Whether it's an RMF framework, NIST 853 controls, or it's a MIBR attack framework, what you're doing is trying to map out risk, right? So let's do it from a more behavioral threat-informed perspective versus that of pen and paper exercises.
Thanks, Jason. Darren, Jason talked a lot about the MIBR framework, and your commercial experience at AWS and others before that is MIBR becoming widely adopted, and how in commercial and federal, and how can that framework inform their agency decisions about their zero trust implementation?
I would say absolutely is becoming very critical, both in commercial and public sector. I love the fact that last week CISA put out their guide about how to map the MIBR framework to different things, and that was fantastic. That was one of the first times I saw that they fully were embracing and moving forward with that model, and it's a great way to really talk about risk. And I know we just talked about how to measure risk, but what the measuring of risk is really trying to reduce the uncertainty that you have and how you manage cybersecurity. And so the AttackIQ model, to be able to understand adversarial behaviors and be able to validate controls with that really does help remove some of that uncertainty of that failing silent problem, right? So it's a huge value of having MIBR and companies like AttackIQ to be able to provide that. When we bring it around to the conversation about the zero trust implementation, it's also that zero trust really is a journey where you have to do an evaluation process of your data, your identity, and your networking infrastructure. And I do believe that taking a data-centric model is a good model to follow. And the reason for that is typically that attackers, their end goal is your data. And the end goals, the attacker has to traverse the networks using identities to get to the data, right? So MIBR is this wealth of real-world detection mitigation information about the attacker groups and the TTPs they use to traverse networks using identities to get to your data, right? So it becomes this great mental model for prioritizing your cybersecurity activities and helping become a strategy to prioritize the controls that you use to what I call increase the cyber economic cost to the attacker. And what that means is by using these types of tools, you can have the power to change the way they behave. You have to change how they invest in new tooling and new ways of attack, which can increase their costs and their risks, right? And the AttackIQ continuous validation, it's a great way to really help reduce that uncertainty and lead to this threat-informed defense model.
Thanks, Darren. Please, members of the audience, please type your questions into the chat box to get into the conversation here. Jason, I wanted to ask you earlier, and sorry I forgot to do this, but you've worked in both commercial and federal, and almost all this conference today has been about commercial. This is really the only federal session, I think, here. Just for those people that aren't that used to federal, what do you think's different in the federal government, at least about, how, do they have different risks, the same risks, or how do they handle those risks?
Well, I think
evaluation.
Yeah, great question, Mark. And I think again, risk is subjective, right? But obviously, being biased and supporting the public sector and knowing what's at stake and not protecting such can cause grave damage, right? But that being said, we're experiencing the same style of attacks, right? Ransomware, nation state groups, threat actors, nationalists, right? Hacktivists, whatever the case may be. They all have motives. I think the difference, again, is the fact that we have these large backbone networks that we have to protect against. So the entry points of these networks that we're still, cataloging, starting to understand what the assets are that lie within, it creates a safe haven, if you will, for attackers to be able to use that as a launch point, right? So when you have other industry, commercial, private sector who are responsible for a much lower scale of assets and whatnot, then it becomes that much easier to obviously protect and defend against, albeit they still have the same issues that we see in the federal government. A lot of it does come back, again, to the funding aspect of it. But to go back to what Darren had mentioned about the playbooks, right, and the MIBR attack framework, every attacker isn't successful, right? Every attacker isn't successful in maybe moving laterally. They may move laterally, but they didn't capture the intellectual data that they were after in the first place, right? So what we come to find out from a blue team perspective is that, albeit these nation state actors and threat actors, adversaries alike, had this mission, this goal, we always hear they only have to be right or what is it? We have to be right every time, and they only have to be right once, or something along those lines. Well, that's not true. They have to be right all the time as well, because this is it's a planned attack. And it goes through a course of multiple playbooks, all of which we can replicate from a continuous validation standpoint. Because at the end of the day, post-breach TTPs, tactic, techniques, and procedures, those are redundant. There's only so many ways that you can establish persistence on a Windows machine or move laterally from one machine to another. So we can start to operationalize that by way of the MITRE ATT&CK framework and start to automate that hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, even yearly. At least we have some sort of visibility, again, going back to that empirical data, and again, be able to make decisions that are going to put us in a better posture to support, defend, and protect against these adversaries.
Hey, Mark, mind if I jump in here for a second and pick it back on Jason? Because the big thing for me when we talk about commercial versus public sector is that, you know, government has historically believed that to be secure, you have to move slow. And one thing that the commercial organizations have truly started to learn, a lot of this fueled by the adoption of cloud, is that you can be secure and be extremely agile and move fast at the same time. And so I'm hoping that we can use that kind of knowledge base and how you do that, operationalizing, making it secure and fast, and bringing those lessons learned from the commercial side over public sector as well.
So one other thing I'd add, and part of your question was, are the risks different? And I think they are between federal and commercial in this way. Commercial, it's usually a business and it's profit that's going to be impacted and capital. Whereas in the government, it's an embarrassment to the government. It could be life or limb in some cases, and things like that. So there's some contrast in differences there, I think. What the adversary intent is based off who they're attacking, and that's probably what the risk equates to. I definitely think, as far as you know, to Darren's point about the agility, yeah, government, you know, the cliche is, you know, government works slow, but there's a lot of red tape that we go through. You know, acquisitions processes are put in place for special reasons to give fair and equal opportunities to everyone to win a bid or whatever. Whereas I think commercial, you know, the CEO, you know, or the CISO can say, I want that, and they'll go get it. And sometimes, and they don't have all the government red tape, I'll call it, for lack of a better term, that we have, I think, in some instances.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. And I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, but you made a comment about you know, commercial being a profit motive and versus government maybe life and limb. I've been working on the capability maturity model for certification program that DoD's put into place, and the issue is that even if you're a commercial vendor out there, if you have government contracts, you're oftentimes working with sensitive government data, and you've got to protect your networks. And going in through commercial enterprises is often one of the attack vectors of the foreign governments trying to steal government intellectual property or find out things that give them a competitive advantage on the battlefield. So, you know, I highly encourage anybody that does work with the government that you really have to adopt the same kind of a risk posture that the government does with respect to that mission being so critical. Jerry, what from things that the government might buy from industry, what are the things about implementing zero trust? I realize it's not a technology, it's a framework, it's an attitude, it's all kind of things, but there are some certain tools, certain technologies that you need. And where do you think the gaps are right now that are out there that would really accelerate implementing zero trust in both commercial and federal?
So I'll have to work through my model a little bit to answer your question, if that's all right. So it's very data centric, and I think Darren said that, and I totally agree, where it's very data centric. So I found, well, we actually had a project back at my old job where we found that people weren't properly categorizing their data because they were looking at FIPS 199-2, and a lot of those categories didn't apply, and they didn't know one way or another. So they were applying categories that weren't even applicable to our agency. So first of all, categorize the data and understand what the data is. So there are tools that I've looked at that kind of help with that. as well as what the flow of your data is. A lot of people, I hear them talk about zero trust and it's a user accessing data. Well, no, system to system, there's other triggers that make data flow different places. It's not always the human accessing data in the static location kind of thing. So that kind of quirks me a little bit when they start doing that. But categorizing the data, and there are tools that can look and say, based on the type of data you have, that this is probably a high rated data or medium or whatever. We'll also map flows. Working back, and this is where I kind of differ. I know Darren mentioned networks, identity networks and data, but I kind of flow away from networks unless it's an on-prem and I can manage it. Right now, we have some places that are doing BYOD. Like Mark's sitting in front of the coffee shop there having his Budweiser, and you know he's using a free network probably. Well, he's doing that. Oh, it's Starbucks. And so
with a VPN.
With a VPN, okay. So so I'm not necessarily, if he wasn't using a VPN, if we were doing BYOD, I'm not managing that network. But what's really facilitating access to the data from to the user, if we're talking to user access and data, it's the application. A lot of people talk about the device and putting agents. I can't put devices on. I can't put the same device agents, great security agents that I put on a laptop or a desktop, put on a mobile device. So I would like to get to unified endpoint management, and because the same devices are accessing the same data. So how can I, reduce that risk? But I really think the actual facilitation is application, whether that be browser, client-based, or whatever. How do we better get knowledge to protect around that, get the protections around that application that actually facilitate? Now, I'm not saying don't do anything with the device. I think there's still, even if it's a managed application service, you're not doing managed device service, at least we know in some government networks, there's certain manufacturers we do not want, and you can do that through managed application, or if they're not on a certain iOS, we can block those. But, when I'm managing a device, there's other factors that I'm going to look at, whether it's patched, latest iOS and other things, and I can probably enclave it. So I'm not saying don't do anything with your managed network. You can enclave, quarantine, and bring things back into compliance. And then it's the identity. And I'm not just talking about the human, I'm also talking about the device, the right data to the right people at the right time. And you also got to assess the device. I like to use I'm sorry to go long, but I like to use the movie theater analogy, right? Right now, I go to the multiplex movie theater. I usually go to Potomac Mills because they got the IMAX. But let's say I bought a ticket to the newest release and I bought the regular ticket. Where did they take my ticket? They take it in the lobby. I now have access to the whole network of the movie theater because I can go into any movie. Why? There's not ticket takers at the door. And unfortunately, I don't see ushers coming in constantly checking to see if I'm supposed to be in that movie. And if I want to go to the IMAX theater, there should be a ticket taker at the door saying, oh, you got to go upgrade your ticket. And then there should be an usher coming in every time and saying, are you supposed to be here? Are you supposed to be here? Are you supposed to be here? We got to get to that point as well and get away from this linear fashion of authentication and access and do it constant authentication, access, and evaluating it. That's something, a lot of people take zero trust from the identity standpoint, and there's so much more. That is great. I don't care where you start. I'm an inside out guy. Start with the data, work my way back. The identity is one of those main pillars. A lot of people start there because that's what they're familiar with, but it's so much more than that I think that's what I've spent my last few years is educating. No, it's not just about the identity. There's other things that are going on here that we have to pay attention to. Sorry, long-winded answer.
That's a great summary too. Darren, for a final closing statement, would you like to react to that or make any other point that you felt we didn't get to today?
Sure. First off, I absolutely agree what Jerry's saying. For me, I bucket it all into identity, right? So what he's talking about is really adaptive authentication processes, things like that, and they're absolutely critical. Completely agree. To me, they kind of fall into that big identity bucket, whether you're using YubiKeys or whether you're using other things and certificates on devices, things like that. I do believe that the technologies are out there to handle the majority of the things identified in the EO. The problem becomes for the end user is that you have 500 different tools you have to deploy and figure out how to make them all work together to implement that process, right? So it becomes problematic, but I do believe that we can operationalize the goals of the EO. I believe it's possible, and it's definitely not going to be done in a day. but I think we get there by taking a strategic approach. And you got to understand what you can do now and what you can't, and then just be intellectually honest about where those gaps are, and then try and the best you can to leverage these current opportunities to combine the emerging technologies with things like the TMF, the Technology Modernization Fund, and build a roadmap of how you're going to do technology acquisition and integration, how you're going to address that skills gap that's prevalent across the globe in cybersecurity, and then building organizational maturity to figure out the rest over time.
And Jason, I'll give you the last word here today as we wrap up
Sure.
This panel.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think I learned that Jerry likes to pay for one ticket and spend the entire day at the movie theater. But no, outside of that, I mean, these are all great concepts, right? As far as making it much more secure for folks that want to do bad to actually be able to do bad things across the network. Right, that's great, and we understand that. We've been trying to build that out in the federal government for years now. I think we're finally getting to a better place with the new administration, putting a lot more focus and funding and effort along with this initiative. At the same time, human capital is at risk, right? So we still get back to the skills gap issue. We get back to there's not enough red teamers or blue teamers alike. But if we have this technology that can start to automate and play out these styles of attacks as if the adversary is, then why not utilize that? And obviously, AttackIQ provides that functionality as well as others, right? But the notion here is that we need to start to understand that we are losing. We are losing greatly to nation states, and we need to do better. And it's also a catch-22, right? Coming from especially the private sector and working for a vendor and saying we want cybersecurity to be, it's almost like saying you want to solve world hunger. The reality is that there's always going to be folks that want to do bad things. And we're going to be there to help our customers understand what those bad things are by playing that out in a safe setting. The one last thing I will leave you with is that semantics often get in the way, right? When we start to talk about exploitation or breach and things of that nature, we're talking about the MIBR attack framework that's looking at gaps and weaknesses across people, processes, and technologies through a series of identified tactics, techniques, and procedures that have been documented in the past attacks. So we're not talking about anything new here. This is documented. We already had this intelligence. Why not utilize it and start to understand what the realm of possibility is, whether it's China, Russia, or insert any other country there.
Thanks so much, Jason. Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Jerry. I want to thank everyone for participating in the Purple Hats webinar. And please be safe, everyone. Have a great afternoon.